For income, it's a little bit, this is shift factor number 2. And in shift factor number 2, what we're saying here is that there are some goods that are normal goods and there are some goods that are inferior goods. Most goods, I don't know, maybe about 80% of all products are what we would call normal goods. Where as our income goes up, we buy more of things. As our income goes down, we buy less of them. As my income has gone up, I have noticed that I've bought many, many more books. I just came back from a trip from Philadelphia. I went to Philadelphia with 1 suitcase. I came back with 2. And the second suitcase was like 70 pounds and it was just full of books. And my wife got very grumpy, but what could I say? She married an academic. And I'm an academic who has a job, so I've got income. If my income were to go down, probably one of the first things I would do is not buy as many books. Books are a normal good. What about inferior goods, though? Inferior goods are these types of goods that you actually buy less of as your income goes up. So that would be something like ramen noodles. But I'm not talking about like good Japanese ramen noodles. I'm talking about the, 15-cent, wafer thing that you have to put in the microwave, right? The thing that we all eat, and maybe you probably eat it, but we all eat it for a time, but certainly we would not continue to eat it if our income went up. Right? Or taking the bus. If you're an unfortunate soul that takes the bus places, you probably will not ride the bus more if your income quadrupled, right? Unless you're a hardcore environmentalist or the bus is more convenient, you're not likely to ride the bus more as your income goes up. Bus rides are an inferior good. What that means then is that if the event is that my income increases, then my demand curve will shift out. I'm adding this prime here to denote what the new demand curve is. So the demand curve is shifting from here to here. The demand curve is going to shift to the right if it's a normal good when my income increases. Alternatively, if this is an inferior good, my demand will actually decrease. So I added a double prime here to kind of denote the difference between the two. If it's an inferior good and my income increased, I'll buy less of it. If the event, on the other hand, is that my income is decreasing, initiative. Trying to stay color coordinated here. If the income is decreasing, it'll shift to the right if it's an inferior good, and will shift to the left if it's a normal good. These again are shifts. This is shift factor number 2. We also have to think about related goods, and there are two kinds of relationships that exist. Goods can either be substitutes or complements to each other. There are some goods that we can use in place of one another or substitute for one another. There are other products that we consume together. So substitute goods, right? Movies and plays? I don't know. I really like movies. I don't like plays. I don't know. For me, I worry about this close. Whether I'm driving a car or a truck, I really don't care, right? I just drive to work. So, and I'm an academic, so I don't care what kind of vehicle I drive to get to work. So cars or trucks are substitutes for one another. Whether I drink tap water or bottled water, they are substitute goods for each other for me. Now what that means, let's use my example of cars and trucks. So I am telling you that cars and trucks are substitutes for me. That they both do the job of getting me to work and back. And the question is that what happens in the car market if I tell you that the price of trucks fell? So trucks are falling in price. Then what I'm asking you about here is what's going to happen in the car market. So I'm told you about what happens to the price of trucks, but now I want you to tell me what's going to go on in the car market. And what I'm saying is going to happen here is that if they are substitutes, then people will buy fewer cars. Because instead, what people are going to be doing, right, we know from the law of demand, is that people are going to be buying more trucks. Right? This is going on because of the law of demand. In the car market, it's not that the price of cars changed. It's that the price of something I could buy instead changed. And that's going to affect the demand for cars. Because people are just, I'm going to buy a truck as my next vehicle if the price of trucks falls. Now we also have other goods that are complements to each other. Movies and popcorn, that would be an incredibly strong one, certainly for me. And this class is all about me, so I'm going to use that as the example here. If they are complements, notice how this is spelled with an E, by the way. Not with an I. Complement spelled with an I there would be like, hey, you look good. No, this is not that. This is complement of like goods used in conjunction with each other. So whenever I go to a movie, I'm saying I have to eat popcorn. And whenever I eat popcorn, it's almost always when I'm at the movies. So the question would be, what if I tell you that the price of movies is falling? Then what's going to happen in the popcorn market if these two things are complements? So here's my demand for popcorn. If the price of movies are falling, I'm going to eat more popcorn. Because I'm going to end up going to the movies more and eating the popcorn when I go to those movies. I'm sorry, I forgot to add this. That was shift factor number 3. Shift factor number 4 is a rather easy one. And that's just the number of buyers. With the simple idea that more buyers causes a rightward shift. Fewer buyers causes a leftward shift. This isn't that difficult to see. And then finally, we have for future expectations that I will buy more or less depending on what I expect to have happen to the price in the future. And what that would mean is that I can have my demand for cars, let's say with my price and quantity, if I expect the future price to fall, then I probably won't want to buy the car now, right? I'll probably wait until the future. So this is kind of like the cars in the now market, right? Like right in this case, this year. But if I expect prices of cars to fall next year, why would I buy the car now, right? So we'll see single prime here, a leftward shift of the demand curve. Because why would I buy a car now if I expect the price to fall in the future? If, on the other hand, I expect the future price to rise, I'll buy more now. Can't say enough about slide 26. Slide 26 would be your signal that you know what's going on here. As you can see from the past 6-7 slides that I've just done, 6 slides that I've done, there is a distinct difference between a change in the quantity demanded and a change in demand. This right here is coming from my law of demand. Which is just coming from my change in price. This right here, change in demand, that's talking about, again, let's get the right number here. The factors that we talked about on slides 21 through 25, right? One of those other things changing. And the way that this looks different is that, right, there's my movement along the curve versus a change in the curve. Or you could look at it in this fancy picture right here. Okay, so let's see where we're at here then. Our willingness to pay then is reflected in that demand curve. We have a law of demand that shows us then that inverse relationship between the price and the quantity. If something other than the price is changing, that's when I shift the demand curve. There is only one thing that causes a change in the quantity demanded. That would be a change in the price. On the other hand, we have several factors, 5 factors, that can cause a shift in the demand curve. And those would be the things, again, that shift our demand curve rather than move along our demand curve. Okay, I'm going to pause the video right here. I'm going to keep the video going here, but I'm just going to pause it for my purposes, just so I can at least drink some water a little bit, and then I can continue this on. So to continue on here, we've got the other side of this market, which would be our supply curve. So the supply curve now is talking about it from the perspective of the producer. And now we're talking about what's the maximum amount of product that producers would be willing to offer at the various prices, holding the other factors constant, which then gives us a law of supply, which works in the opposite direction as our law of demand. What this law of supply essentially says, if I still continue on with my car's description here, is that the supply curve is upward sloping. And so it's saying ceteris paribus, or all other things being equal, that when the price goes up, the quantity supplied goes up. That when the price rises, quantity supplied rises. It explains our movement along the curve, that I go from point A to B along the supply curve. As my price goes up, my quantity supplied goes up. And what we see from that is what I've just described here. Our supply curve then shows us that positive relationship. We're getting that by the law of supply. I have an upward sloping supply curve where my price is going up and my quantity supplied is going up. Now, I have shift factors as well. Right, because what we're again saying here is that I can have a movement along the curve. Try to draw it as a demand curve. Sorry about that. That I can change the price and that can lead to for me a movement. Versus these other things that can cause either a increase in supply or a decrease in supply. And here we have 6 shift factors that we'll need to talk about that cause one of these two kinds of shifts versus my law of supply, which just talks about my movement along the curve. So let's start out first with production technology. In production technology, we're talking about how it is that I combine the inputs to produce the output. And the simple idea here is that most of the time I get better technology. And better technology means that I would have an increase in the supply curve. Increase in supply is my rightward shift of the supply curve. Now, just to make it abundantly clear, let's just use this as my example here. I don't know, let's just say I have a process that was written out on a single piece of paper and I lose that piece of paper. So somehow my technology gets worse. Again, it's a kind of a weird scenario I've just outlined for you. I'm aware of that, but I want to show you why it's the case that the leftward shift is the decrease in supply. Because it's not visually apparent that that's a decrease in supply. Well, the way that I can show you that it is actually visually apparent is draw a horizontal line. Because now you're saying that at that price, let's say that the price is $10, at the price of $10, the quantity supplied is now only 100, whereas it used to be 1,000 before. That's how it's visually apparent that this is a decrease in supply. Right? Because this quantity supplied at that point is less than what it was then. I'm sorry, this is shift factor 1. I feel like I'm going to forget to do that each time, so I'm going to I'm going to do my work ahead of time here. Shift factor number 2. Shift factor number 3. Shift factor number 4. Shift factor number 5. And shift factor number 6. In shift factor number 2 here, what I'm talking about is the cost of the resources, the things that are used to produce the product. If those things are going up in price, then what you would see is a decrease in supply. This was the argument that was made for when the Affordable Care Act, or what's more popularly known as Obamacare, when that was passed, or they were thinking of passing it. This was the argument that those who were against it were making, is that giving everyone health care is going to raise the cost of providing health care, and raise the cost of hiring employees. And as you raise the cost of hiring employees, then what happens is that it increases the cost of doing business, and you would decrease how much the firms actually produce, which is why some said that it would cause a recession when the Affordable Care Act was passed. I mean, it didn't happen. That's not to say that their argument was false or not. I don't really know what the data tells us. It didn't happen, but the argument that they were making was economically, theoretically reasonable. This was the argument they were making. If I raise labor costs by giving everyone now health care, it would cause firms to make less. And if they're making less, that could cause a recession. It could go the other way as well. I suppose I write this out here. The other side of this would be, right, if you ever taken a Uber ride somewhere, those drivers are self-employed, meaning that the firm, Uber or Lyft, does not pay Social Security taxes, they don't pay health insurance. For them to hire workers is really, really cheap because they're just paying a base wage. Which means that if that kind of labor arrangement is legal, which is questionable, right? That's kind of the critique of this quote-unquote gig economy, is that it's right, that workers have a job, but they're not getting the same benefits that they are. But if that becomes legitimate and now firms don't have to pay for Social Security taxes or for health insurance or other things, that can cause an increase in the supply curve. As for shift factor number 3, what we can see here is that firms often can sell other products given their assembly line and their labor force. The idea with this is that instead of the car manufacturer making cars, they could make trucks, which means that they care very deeply then what the price of cars and trucks are. So if it turns out that the price of trucks are rising, then in the car market, in terms of supply, firms are not going to want to make as many cars as they used to because the thing they could sell alternatively or make alternatively is going up. As opposed to if it turns out that no one wants to buy trucks because car prices or gasoline prices are going up, then in the car market, firms are going to make cars instead. So other commodities, other products that they could produce affects the other market. Future expectations matter as well, more for some goods than others, but if you would, let's talk about one where it would really matter. Oil, right? I'm storing my oil under the ground because then I'm drilling it up and then selling it. Well, the idea here is that what I could do is I could either drill out more or less than, depending on the future prices. If the future price is expected to rise, then what we'll see here is that as a firm, I'm probably not going to want to sell that much right now. Right? So let's call this the right now market. As opposed to the future price falling, which in that kind of market for my supply curve, that would mean I'm going to try to get rid of as much as I can right away, and I'm going to produce more. Shift factor number 5. I'm not entirely certain why they decided all of a sudden to show you an arrow. This is a pretty easy one though, right? If I have more sellers, that's going to cause a rightward shift in my supply curve. Fewer sellers, you're going to see that with the leftward shift in the supply curve. That should be a pretty easy one. And then finally, again, I don't know why they decided to make us arrows here. It's accurate, it's just I don't think it helps describe things accurately. For shift factor number 6, taxes and subsidies, which is basically subsidies are when the government pays you to do something. A tax will mean that I produce less. That's the whole point of taxing cigarettes, for instance, is so that firms don't want to make cigarettes. Or on the other hand, right, you get a subsidy to buy an electric car or to buy a produced electric car. The whole point of that is so that we have more electric cars out there. And this is all that we've seen then. This would be, just going back to this here, this would be slide 31. I'm sorry. This would be slide 31. That's my law of supply. This would be slides 33 through 38. I shift in the supply curve, either increasing or decreasing. But notice the difference here of this right here is an increase in supply, a shifting of the entire curve. This is an increase in quantity supplied. Or a movement along the curve. And so that kind of finishes our discussion of supply. Here, our checkpoint then is that the supply curve then reflects what producers are willing and able to supply at certain prices. I can, just like I had with demand, my market supply curve means that I can just sum up the individual suppliers, right? And that we then have the things that cause the shifts in supply, as opposed to our movement along the supply curve. And then once we put this demand and supply together, then we're now focused on the last big part of this chapter, which is the equilibrium, which is then basically where my demand and supply curve now meet. So the idea here then is that if I'm not at the market equilibrium, then I either have a shortage or a surplus. What does it mean to say that we have the right price? To say that we have the right price means that I'm right here. That demand equals supply. Or that quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. There's just as much being made as people are buying it. What happens if the price is right here? Let's call it P1. At P1, the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. The quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. This is known as my surplus. At P3, my quantity demanded is greater than my quantity supplied. This is known as my shortage. It's only at the equilibrium where they are equal to each other. Then the question becomes, well, what happens when there's a shortage and surplus? And what we see is that when there's a surplus, there tends to be downward pressure on the prices. And that as the price falls, what do we know? We know from the law of demand that the quantity demanded rises. And we know from the law of supply that the quantity demanded or quantity supplied falls. And that's what we see right here, right? There's my law of demand at work. And here's my law of supply at work. And over here, right, when there's a shortage, then there's going to be upward pressure on the prices. And this makes sense, right? When there's a surplus, you're just trying to get rid of the stuff. So that's when companies like put things on sale and they just try to get rid of it. When there's a shortage, the firm has to find out some way to allocate the scarce things that they have. Because the price is rising, what we know is that from the law of demand that the quantity demanded falls. We know from the law of supply that the quantity supplied rises. And we see those same kind of things happening here, affecting both of these things. So there's this constant movement, gravitation to this one fantastic point, the equilibrium point. The question then comes to what happens when I then shift the demand curve and shift the supply curve. How does that change where I'm at for the equilibrium? Right? A simple picture of this would be that if I draw out a picture like this and I have my demand curve and I have my supply curve, here's my equilibrium price and quantity. If I increase my demand like this, now my equilibrium price and quantity are now each higher. Sorry, I should do it this way. And vice versa, right? So the equilibrium can change as demand curve shifts or supply curve shifts. Same with supply curve then, right? So I can draw this out where then I can have my supply and demand with an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity, and I can decrease my supply and get a decrease in my equilibrium quantity and an increase in my equilibrium price. Right, and I could do it for the opposite as well. Oh, jeez, I didn't even realize this. Franzia wine. Oh, God. Right, how can I sell wine at $2 a bottle or whatever it is? Right, well, the idea here was that Franzia had too many grapes. They had extra wine that they wanted to sell, so they sold to Trader Joe's. That's surplus, and it drives the price down. And people then drink more wine, right? That's kind of the idea of this. Now, as we start to kind of come to some conclusions about this, the idea then is that I can predict what will happen to the equilibrium when only one curve shifts, but when both curves shift, now I've got a bigger problem because I don't know exactly what's going to happen. Let me give you the best description of this. What happens if supply increases and demand increases? Let's say that my supply increases because I have more sellers. Let's say that my demand increases because I have a greater preference for the item. Right? These are both events that would cause these curves to shift. What happens is that here's my supply curve and demand curve. What happens? Right? I could shift my supply curve. I could shift my demand curve. But look at the way that I shifted them. I shifted them in such a way that there was no change in the price, but there was a change in the quantity. But let me draw this a slightly different way. Same direction. Now, I'm getting my an increase in the equilibrium price and an increase in the equilibrium quantity. Right here, there was no change. Here, I get an increase in both. And then let's do it a third way. And you kind of probably can predict what I'm going to try to do here. Let's have a very slight increase in demand, a very dramatic increase in supply, which I did in the same color. Sorry, class. At least you can tell I'm doing this without a script. Sorry, class. You'll forgive me. Thank you. Here, and if we look at all three of these pictures, the equilibrium quantity always increased, but the equilibrium price, we don't know what happens. We don't know what happens because we don't know the relative shift. So I would have to give you more information. That the number of additional sellers is very slight, or that the change in preferences is quite dramatic, right? I'd have to tell you in words something about the magnitude of the shifts and how they're different. And this happens when both curves shift. Whereas for these, for this, where was it? For this kind of curve right here, this was known changes because only one curve shift. One curve shifted. And that then brings us to our checkpoints, right? The checkpoint here then for equilibrium is that the equilibrium comes from where demand equals supply. And that when those curves change, that then changes the equilibrium. Most of the time that can be predicted when only one of the curves shifts. Then I can predict what's going to happen. But I will not be able to predict it when both curves shift. And that's what we see here. There's our summary. Okay. That ends probably the longest chapter for this class. So you may have to